Good morning. I'm Chochma and Beis, volume 3. We're on page 1232. So yesterday we learned in explaining a higher level of cognitive experience where not only are the emotions more refined and expanded and more mature, which is what Binah, comprehension, does. Mature, God was Ima, the maturity of Binah that expands, refines, focuses the emotions, but doesn't transform them, does not change their natural structure, does not, so it's called hatva. They still remain within the way they were naturally wired inside the person. So we came to Gadlus Abba, on the other hand. The bittul of Chochma has the power to transform these very emotions. So even someone that's chesed, a person chesed, can behave in a way of gvura, or vice versa. The capacity to go outside of the natural parameters in the avodah of the person. And he explained why, because midas are hamshacha v'yerida. They're about extending and about expressing. So they relate, as they relate to another, they relate to a relationship, so they're not capable of transforming themselves. Binah in Seichel is more similar to that aspect as well. Like you said, Binah is not, Moichin, on the other hand, before we get to Binah, Moichin is in a state of Aliyah and Havdalah. It goes inward, it removes itself as it goes inward in understanding something and using the mind. In Moichin itself, that's the difference between Binah and Chochma. Binah relates, so therefore, and that's why it cannot also elevate the midas to another state than their natural order. Chochma, on the other hand, because it's removed and because it goes inward and upward, similar to Tainu compared to Ratzon, that's why it has the power to actually turn the midas into sichlim mamish, and to go out able to have them be removed, to free themselves or somewhat untie themselves from their natural structure. In the parentheses, we learn more details. The ovis are like that. That was says that's similar to what it says about the ovis, that their entire beings were completely dedicated to something greater than they were. He says not just hatva gashmis, but also hatva ruchnis. Not just their physical structure, but also their spiritual structure. And explained the tefach, that the tefach is that idea that lifts something up from beyond the very natural structure. Tefach mina aretz. The root of the mevsim, and that's the yud. Okay, so general speaking, is the midas become on the level of das elyon, not das tacht. And also, Gadlus Abba, what else does it achieve? It actually changes the emotions. In other words, Avram, who even though the natural love for a child, it changes that natural love, and he was able to do the Akedah. And similarly, when Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel reverse their natural personalities, where Beis Shammai who's naturally Gvura, but he rules in a form of ahet to matirim, the Kule Beis Shammai, that he is more lenient, and Beis Hillel, who's naturally Chesed, is more Gvura. That's a shini ba'amidus, and that comes from Moichin da Abba. And the final thing he said was that it also, in the context of the sensation of the feelings, that from Binah you still have some sense, even though the midas are not untamed as in an immature person, a mature child, they're harnessed and they're directed and they're focused. but they still have some hergish. Whereas, he says, you can't say they're completely sensationless. But for Meichin the Abba, there's a total bittul, and therefore the midas, biltim megoshim, don't have a sensation, meaning there's no expressed feeling, and they're not in the form of a mitzias. They're completely absorbed in the bittul of Chochma. Now, to explain this, he's going to continue on page 1232. What is the difference between Chochma and Binah? Why does Chochma have this impact on the emotions, this transformative impact and this elevated impact? And Binah does not have it to that extent. So he says, Ayin and Yesh, the new paragraph on page 1232, and the pages can be found at ayinbeis.com if you want to follow along. So he says the inyan in this is the hineklolos hahefresh ben Chochma and Binah. The general difference between Chochma and Binah is this: hu hahefresh ben Ayin and Yesh. The difference between an Ayin and a Yesh. If I recall correctly, this was said already earlier. I don't remember, I'm not sure exactly where, but I remember in the beginning of the topic, he mentioned this. Well, we definitely learned it earlier. Okay, so the difference in Ayin and Yesh is not as it literally suggests. Ayin means nothing and Yesh means something. Ayin is a state of bittul, Yesh is a state of being. So this can be very subtle. But when something experiences in a state of Ayin, there's no self involved. Complete dedication to something greater than itself. Like we learned in the Banda Volume 2, the Ayin, Yesh, Ayin, Yesh. And the Ayin itself at two levels. Ayin is a state of nullification or state of suspension or sublimation, if you wish. Yesh is when there's a state of being where there's a sense of an identity. So in general, when we say Chochma ma'ayin timotza, Chochma comes from Ayin, ma'ayin, which is also why Chochma is only a spark and just barely a nakuda, a point, because it has no substance of its own. It's something is there, but that something is like a nothing, in a sense. When I say nothing, it means like it's not substantial in a type of sense, identity and structure. Binah, on the other hand, is a yesh. It's a fully developed idea. Chochma is the level of ayin, this state of bittul that I just described, and Binah is a state of yesh, b'chinas yesh. Shari inyan habina, because Binah is who asagas hadover. It's comprehending a particular matter, whatever it is that you're focusing on. Binah is comprehending it. Shazeu sha'inya baba b'chinas yeshes atcha musig v'nitfus. That alone tells you that the idea has come into a state of yeshes. Yeshes here again doesn't mean ego, as we say somebody's egocentric or arrogant. Here, yeshes means that there's something like to hold on to. He says, "Acha musig v'nitfus." If Binah did not have yeshes, she wouldn't be able to understand the idea, because understanding the idea means that the idea develops into details and is expanded. There's something to talk about, something to hold on to. Acha musig, to the point that it's understood, and nitfas, and graspable, which means that we can contain it, we can relate to it. If it remains in the state of Chochma, which we'll talk about shortly, then it's still very much a very abstract point. So Binah, by definition, means that there's a yesh, there's something to hold on to. If, for example, someone were to share an idea with you, and you don't understand it, and you can't, there's no handles, there's nothing to hold on to, then it's not Binah. So Binah, by definition, means that there's an entity that is identifiable and graspable. B'zeu loshen hasoga. So meloshen hasoga yad. An interesting touch. Hasoga. When we say hasoga generally means that we can comprehend. But hasoga has another word, hasoga yad, which means that it is reachable. It's something that the hand, there's an expression hasoga yad, that means your hand can touch it or your hand can reach it. It's within arm's reach, as they say. So he's teaching hasaga, even though hasaga on the intellectual level means comprehension, but he says it also comes from the word hasaga siyat. Shezehu shu mitzias davar hanitfiz biyad. So, for example, when it says to somebody that it's not hasaga siyat in halacha, it means you can't reach it. It's beyond your reach. Now, that doesn't always mean physically. It doesn't mean like it's a mile away, you can't reach it. It could also be something that you can't hold on to with your hand. Like, for example, in Tanya, in Shaykhud Vamuna, the Alter Rebbe, when he brings a shlila, he says that something is so out of the realm of sensation that it would be like someone saying that you can't touch seichel with your hand. And he says, anyone that says that, it's laughable to say that. You don't even negate it. To someone to say, you know what, you can't touch seichel with your hand. Why is it laughable? Because seichel is completely not in the realm of grasp with your hands. You need very different tools to understand something. So when someone says, I want to have an apple, I want to have a pear, an orange, I want to have a book, fine. That's something that's tangible. It's physical. So therefore, your hand can reach it. You can touch it. I'm just using it as an example. So when you say something is basogas yad, the heseg yad or asogas yad, it means it's attainable. And the hand can, it doesn't necessarily mean, there it means physical, the hand. But he's saying it means, shehu dover hanitfiz biyad, something that exists that you can contain and hold with your hand. That's why hasaga is called hasaga. You don't say hasaga on chochma. You say hasaga on binah, meaning I can understand it. So obviously, we're not talking about holding it in your hand physically, but it means that you can contain it and you can hold on to it with your mind. Chochma is a fleeting concept that can easily be very mercurial and very intangible. Bina, by definition, hasaga is that it's contained. The one who's understanding it is able to hold on to it like you can hold on to something what's physical with your hand. And so too it is with Bina. That through comprehending something, the idea, which before you comprehended it was beyond you, has now come, it's become an identity, an existing entity, and a form that you can grasp it. You can grasp the idea. That's why we say, I grasped the idea. I was able to understand the idea. Bina, that's its role, is to make a concept or an idea that otherwise would have not been graspable, that now you can grasp it, you can understand it, appreciate it, and so on. So Bina is explaining here why Bina is a state of Yesh. V'hasaga de Binahi. Now, where does this hasaga come from? It doesn't start from Bina. Before Bina, there's Chochma is going to explain. Because first you need some kernel, some spark of an idea before you are able to explain or understand and grasp it. So he says, the hasaga of Bina comes from the Nukuma Nekudas HaChochma. It comes from the spark, the point, the kernel, the seed, whatever word you want to use. Nekuda means point of Chochma. Because you can't have a comprehension and a grasping something if you don't begin with a nekuda, without some point of departure. So, as the nekuda of Chochma, Ayin and Yesh. So that's what we say when we say that Binah is bringing it from Ayin of Chochma, where it's just barely a nekuda which is like doesn't have substance, doesn't have breadth, it doesn't have width and length. A point is just a point. So Bina is bringing it from Ayin of Chochma to Yesh, from the nekuda of Ayin to the Yesh. Oh, I remember now where he said it. He said the difference between Keser and Chochma, whether it's a nekuda that has shape or there's a nekuda that doesn't have shape. This goes back, we learned it here in this volume, before, in the beginning of the volume, beginning of volume 3. Now I remember. Just want to see something. Hold on. Talked about the nekuda of Chochma and the nekuda of Bina. Yeah, Rishon. Netzel Harishon and Rishon, yeah. I'm looking at page 1214. That's where it is. The Kesser and Chochma, Shneim Bechinis Nekuda. Chochma is Nekuda Siyar Sheyesh Beit Siyur. And Kesser is Nekuda B'li Shum Siyur. Okay. But regardless, compared to Binah, Chochma is just a point. And that's why it's Ayin and Yesh. Shezehu kol inyan habina. This is the entire concept of Binah, the role and the function of Binah, of understanding. Who? L'havi ma'ayin liyesh dafke. That's what Binah is all about. It's to bring from the ayin of Chochma, of just a point, to a yesh, to substance that's graspable, understandable, comprehensible. On the other hand, Chochma, avala Chochma, but Chochma, he b'chinas ayin. Chochma is a state of ayin which is almost without any shape or form, meaning without substance. Like the kernel or the point, the spark, just a seed of an idea. Shehi b'chinas avroka, which is like avroka, like a flash. Avroka is like used as a flash of lightning. It's just a flash, spark. Loi b'chinas tfisa, not in a form that you can hold on to and grasp. Because though it's already, yes, there is something that has happened, the flash of an idea, but it's still in the state of ayin, so it's not in the form of tfisa. So we see here that he's teaching Chochma and Binah as an Ayin Yesh, if you can hold on to it and contain it, or it remains beyond you really, even though it's the beginning of the process. Okay. Now, he's going to go on and explain this a little more in detail based on what we learned. Actually, you may remember some of the ideas that we're going to read now from volume 2. We talks about the mile of Chochma over Binah. But before I continue, I want to just stop if there's any questions. Because he's now going to go further into, in Chochma itself, there are deeper aspects as well that just intensify the understanding of Chochma as Ayin versus Yesh. But I want to just stop if anybody wants clarification or any question. Okay. Now he says like this. Ubefrat. Now you may recall that Chochma has itself several dimensions. There's Chochma as is the beginning of Binah. So it's like a point. You have an idea, whatever level of idea, you then share the idea, or you start fleshing it out, or you share it with others that start developing it. But there's more to Chochma than just that. Chochma also has an element, like we're going to see now, of resonance and of crystallization, like Riyah. So he says, "Ubefrat b'chinas hanoches sichlius, shezeu ikar b'chinas hasichli de Chochma." So Chochma indeed is the beginning of the process of understanding something, but Chochma also has. But then you could just say that Chochma and Binah are two steps, and it's only quantitative, not qualitative difference. Chochma is the beginning of a journey. You need a point, so you start with a point, and then you extend the point, and you expand it. That's Binah. But we've learned, and briefly he's summing it up here, that Chochma is qualitatively a different reality. It has an element of hanoches sichlis, and he says that's ikar b'chinas hasichli de Chochma. Not just that is the beginning point of an idea. It also has a certain hanoches sichlis, means hanoch in Yiddish you say is a leg, up leg. It means there's a certain resonating element that Chochma, you sense a certain truth of the idea. So just to amplify that a bit, and we talked about this as well. Chassidus talks about this. If Binah develops the idea, and we know development can be very elaborate. You can take one spark of an idea and turn it into a 10-page, 20-page, 100-page document. But often what can happen, that when you start developing it and breaking into details, you can go off the reservation. You can go off course to a point where you say, 1 second, is this what the initial idea was about? Which is why Chassidus says that you can go, like we learned in volume 2, that with Binah alone, you can go b'derech haklosin, you can completely wander off. So you always need to have that the compass to keep you honest and true to the point of departure, that the Nekuda of Chochma has in it a certain clarity, a certain resonance of what is the exact source, the beginning of the idea. This happens very often in any type of discussion. You start off with a very powerful idea, and then as it's developed, it gets diluted, and sometimes even goes off course. So though on one hand, Chochma is not graspable, you can't hold on to it, but in quality, there's something about it that preserves the original idea in its purest form. So Hanochas Sichlis is that type of, Hanochas Sichlis is that clarity that you have. Like, let's say you have a problem, and then you have an epiphany, and the spark or the flash of Chochma says, I have an idea. That moment of an idea, there's a certain resonating element to it. It still needs to be developed and fleshed out and spelled out. But there's something there that's very closer to the core truth of the idea. That's Hanochas Sichlis. In Chochma itself, that distinguishes Chochma from Binah, not just that it's a point and not an expansion, that qualitatively it has something in the seichel of Chochma, it has a deeper, a resonating element. And then he says, furthermore, so Befrat, so this Nekud of Ayin is even more so in the Hanochas Sichlis. Why? Because Hanochas Sichlis, you can't really put your finger on it. In Binah, you can understand the full idea. But you'll see two people can understand something, and one person gets it, and like really gets the punchline and gets the deeper truth. And when another person just knows the idea, you can see many people sometimes say something, and they're on a technical level, they're saying everything correct, but there's something not resonating. And another person has also that resonating element. So that resonating element that comes from Chochma is not tangible. And that's what makes it even more in a state of ayin. Obiyoser, and even more so, increasingly so, in yet another level of Chochma, which is even higher than resonance. And what's that? The Chochma, the visualization of Chochma, where you visualize it. The Chochma has a certain clarity. Clarity is more than just resonance. Resonance is a resonating truth, and there's a certain thing you get, you get it, I get it. Binah develops it. Then there's the Riyah of Chochma, Shu B'chinas Ayin Mamish. That's complete Ayin, because it's not about any seichel here. Hanochas Sichlis is the Chol HaPachas, at least, still in the realm of intelligence. Riyah is not called intelligence. Riyah means it's like you see something, it's so clear to you. So the Chochma has that element of clarity when a person has true Chochma, that is Ayin Mamish. It's a state of Ayin Mamish. So bottom line is, Chochma is Ayin. He just elaborated on the different aspects of Chochma that define why it's, in a sense, without substance, without, I would say, without identity, without structure. In the contrast to Binah, that's a Yesh that has a Metzias and is graspable, and that's its whole purpose. So Chochma, the purpose of Chochma is not to grasp the idea. The purpose of Chochma is to give you the spark, to give you the resonance, and to give you the clarity. It's Binah that develops it into a full-bodied entity that we can hold on to and grasp. Now, of course, the best of both worlds is when you have Chochma and Binah working hand in hand, where the spark of Chochma makes sure and preserves the integrity of the idea, and Binah develops it in a way that's understandable to yourself and to others. As was explained earlier at length, the Inyan B'chinas Chochma and Binah. In the Inyan of Chochma and Binah, correct. Earlier is in volume 2 and volume 1 as well, a number of times where the Rebbe Rashab explained Chochma and Binah quite elaborately. I can give you the places for it. One that comes right to mind, one of the first places is in the beginning of Ayin beginning, in volume 1. I'll just, since I have it in front of me, let me just, if you want to look it up, where there's more details. Chochma and Binah, it was chapter 39, page 66 in volume 1. There's obviously more differences there than the one we just discussed, but that's where it begins. Maybe even earlier, maybe chapter 38. Okay, you look around there, you could see if, but there's more, especially at the end of volume 2. We actually learned it a while back in volume 2. Okay. Any questions? Let's stop here. Let's pause. Okay, it's pretty clear. And it's also clear, I think, where this is going. Because now we're going to understand better and better how Chochma, therefore, because it's Ayin, it actually turns Midas, which are, even if Binah is Yesh and Metzias, you can imagine how much Midas is Yesh and Metzias. Because Binah is still objective, it's still Moichin, it's still intellect. And intellect, by definition, is objective and not about the individual. Midas, on the other hand, is a full Yesh and Metzias because it's all about a person's feelings. And feelings are subjective and emotional. So if so you can understand why Binah, I mean, he's going to say it specifically, but I think it's very clear that Binah, its impact on the Midas is only to direct them and give them the cognitive objectivity and reflection that the mind provides and offers. And Chochma introduces a new level of bittul, an ayin, which impacts the Midas in a far different way, in a far deeper way, as we've been learning. But he's definitely going to spell this out. So I just wanted to show you that it's pretty simple. The flow here is not difficult to imagine where he's going with it. Okay. So now he adds the following. The Zehu, and this difference between Chochma and Binah explains us also the following. Shabina Zehu, and this is what Shabina Nikra Simcha, the Chochma Nikra Eira. So we say every Motzei Shabbos from Megillah. Megillah says to Yehuda Ma'isa Eira v'Simcha v'Sasam v'Yikar. So he's saying Binah is Simcha, joy, and Chochma is called Eira, light. U'Kamesha Kosov, he actually brings the pasuk. LaYehudim Hoisa Eira v'Simcha, Eira hu Chochma, v'Simcha Binah. U'Kamayim Razal Megillah, Daf Tezayin Omid Beis, like the Razal saying the Gemara in the tractate Megillah, page 16b, Daf Tezayin Omid Beis, Eira Zutera, Simcha Zu Yom Tov. Eira is Torah, the Gemara says, and Simcha is the holidays, Yom Tov. Now Torah is understandable, Chochma, but how is Yom Tov Binah? So he explains. Shas Simcha Hiba, what's the connection? Because Simcha comes and manifests B'ispashtus, V'izgalus. What is Simcha? When you define Simcha, what does it look like? Simcha is not in silence and not in a little quiet corner. It's not inward, it's outward. B'ispashtus, it expands, it extends itself. And is galus and revealed. So that's the definition and the identity of Simcha. Hispashtus v'izgalus. It comes, it manifests in an expansive or extended way and revealed way. B'bchinas yesh. Again, yesh here does not mean a negative yesh. It means there's a metzias, there's something to hold on to. There's an existing entity. So Simcha is defined as an expressive, revealed form of your joy. Like when we say v'samachta b'chalgecha, the mitzvah that you shall rejoice b'chalgecha on your holiday. It refers to all the holidays, but specifically Sukkot. So what does that mean? What's the mitzvah? It says rejoice in the chagecha, at your holiday. What does that mean? It means you have to do something. Shehi simcha b'izgalus b'morgish. You have to, in a visible and palpable way, demonstrate joy that it should be revealed, and b'murgish, and should be felt. You dance, you sing, you demonstrate a certain expansiveness that comes when a person is joyous. So it's telling us exactly that's what simcha is. The Rambam says, "Ein simcha kreise," that simcha cannot really be done alone. That's why simcha also leads to chnosas archim, inviting guests, celebrating with others. You make a simcha of a wedding, for example. So yes, there's your joy, but you rejoice with others, and you express it in a very open and revealed way. That's simcha. V'hi ba mibchinas habina. And where's the root of it? In the levels of the spheres, simcha comes from bina. Aim habonim smecha. The mother of the children, smecha, rejoices. So aim is ima, is bina. The bonim is the midas, but aim habonim smecha. So you see the connection that of simcha to aim to bina. Sha'idei hasaga dafka. Because it's dafka through hasaga, through understanding something in an expansive way. Shemasig heitiv hadover eichu mahu, that when a person understands well a subject matter, eich, how and what, the how and the what of this subject matter, eichu mahu, oz yelid hispilus hasimcha begilei rav. Then what will be? It will give birth and a excitable simcha, begilei rav, with great and abundantly revealed, or begilei rav, with the great revelation, great expression. So I know we've moved simcha on its own could be rejoiced during a holiday, but he's also now connecting it to the intellectual process that when a person understands something well, they celebrate. There's a certain celebration. Now, this doesn't mean that's the simcha of Yom Tov, that you have to understand things. He's just pointing out that simcha comes from bina, and bina, like simcha, is expansive, and therefore it leads to simcha. And in ishtalshus, ultimately, is the root for all forms of rejoicing. So what's the connection? Because comprehending something in contrast to Chochma, which is also a very limited, a very concentrated point that's not expanded, where Hasaga comes in a Yesh v'Dover, substance, tangible. Begilia b'murgish, that's revealed and sensed, you feel it palpably. Al-Kain, Mashayelad b'menu, and that's why that which is born from it, Hispilus hanefesh, okay, Mashayelad b'menu, Hispilus hanefesh, the excitement in the soul that is born from it, he has simcha shabo gamkein b'bchinis yesh murgish, is simcha that also manifests itself in a form of substantial presence and tangible feeling and sensation. Because every faculty gives birth to something that's similar to it. So if the birth is expansive, it means that which gave birth to it is expansive. Or the other way around, that which is expansive gives birth to something that's expansive. And being that here we're talking about the faculty of Bina, which is in a state of a yesh, of substance and expansion and identity, al-kain hatulda, higam kein b'chinas yesh. Therefore, its offspring, meaning its fruit, it bears and gives birth also to something that is expansive and has substance. In this case, simcha. That's Bina and Simcha. What about Chochma, which is compared to Eira? Avla Chochma nikra Eira. Chochma is called light. She bechinas Eir HaMeir. What's the main function of light? That it radiates. illuminates. When you look at light, light doesn't really have something of substance. Light is just reflecting and revealing its source. The parentheses are going to explain further. He says the parentheses, like a illuminated face, a shining glow. When you see an aura on someone's face, uponim masbires. So the Chazal, it talks about an illuminated face, meaning a glow, an aura, and this ponim masbires, a face that helps you understand something. Like in other words, you look at someone's face, you understand what they're thinking. Sometimes a facial expression can help understand something. So he says, Shazeh b'chinas Binah behesber v'yispashtus. Ponim masbires is a ponim that is giving some form of understanding. That's Binah behesber v'yispashtus, with explanation and extension or expansion. V'achachmi rak ponim me'iris meir einei chachamim. It's just an illuminated face. You see a glow, but you don't understand. You just see the person, Chachmas Adam Teir Panov. He doesn't bring that, but he brings Meir Einei Chachamim. That Chachamim, Meir Einei Chachamim, that their eyes are lit up or illuminated, or he helps illuminate. In other words, you see an illumination, so you see something, but it's not something you can hold on to or understand. So then why is it called Eira and not Eir? So he says, Mashanikra Eira, in the feminine, Hushemeira la'acherim, because it does radiate to others. Remember, Chochma is not just an isolated entity. It will radiate to Binah. So the Kuda of Chochma does radiate to others, who is Galas Eir. Because it's the state of revealing her. Keser, the superconscious state, there's no revelation at all. Here, there is a conscious revelation. When you look at the face of a wise person, you see a glow, an aura, you can't say there's nothing there. It's just whatever it is there is only a state of ayin, because that person, you see their intelligence shining. Ponim masbires, you actually see something that helps you understand. It's a let's say, a certain intonation or a certain facial expression that a teacher may make, that you look at it, you say, I get what you're saying. So Chochma is also revealing, but it's not revealing anything of substance, it's just revealing something. And in the parentheses, he says, like the difference between Gadol and Gedula. So Gadol is in the masculine, Gedula is in the feminine. I have to look up what it means, but what it seems to be indicating is Gadol is more to yourself, and Gedula is that others appreciate the greatness. In our context, it means that what we're discussing here, remember, that at the end of the day, we want Chochma to have impact on the midas. Yes, to turn them into a higher state, like we said, the sichlim, and without feeling, sensation, absorbed. And Das Elyon, completely connected to a higher objective reality. So it's the Gili Era Chochma Ba Midas, which is bizarre. Zah is the Midas, the emotions. Li is Gam Behem B'chin is Bittel, as we've been discussing here. That they too should have this selflessness. So therefore, it's called Eira, not Eir. Eir would mean an Eir for yourself, and Eira means it is shining outside, but it's not, of course, expanding and defined in an entity like Binah. Now he's going to tie this back to the effect of Binah on Midas and Chochma on Midas. But before I continue, I want to pause again in case anybody needs any clarification here.
I just want to point out, it's so amazing that he's talking about expression, two types of expression on the face. One is like a frown or happy, and the other one's like a certain glow. It's so magical. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. Yeah. Like you could see, I mean, the Gemara talks about it, Rabbi Yehuda. Sometimes you see Chochma Sadar Teir Parnav. You see a person who's shining. There's an aura. And you don't understand why, but you definitely see something. That's like what he said before Riyah. You can see that person has like something, a revelation that has come to them. And then there's them, that face could also express it in a way that you could understand something. Obviously, with words and discussion and real Binah, it comes into details and it becomes more understandable. But that glow is a great thing. That's why that when you learn and you look at your teacher, there's something about looking at the teacher that helps the student understand things.
Is that transmitted through Zoom classes?
Depends who the teacher is, maybe. It depends how close the teacher is to this level of chachma. So maybe then it can also go through Zoom. It also depends on your screen, I assume. Okay. So now he says, and this is now the difference between Chochma and Binah. The Mebina Adarabah nailed him Hamidas b'chinis Yeshu Mitzias Dafka. That from Binah, on the contrary, it also gives birth to something. Like we said, it gives birth to Simcha. It gives birth to Midas, which are Yeshu Mitzias Dafka. Midas is absolutely Yeshu Mitzias, because the whole definition of a Midah is an emotional experience. It has to have some form of expression. Besides the fact that it's also subjective. That's what Midas are, expressive emotions. Now, obviously, you could have a Midah that's still concealed, like we learned. But the definition of a Midah is an experience. It's an interaction. It's a relationship. This will explain, in other words, the mother's womb, which is expansive, gives birth. That's where the child develops. The tipus moya cha'av, the seed of the father, is the nekudas hachachma. Like he speaks in Tanya chapter 2. Okay, I just had a havraka, a flash. I'll talk about it later. Let's see where he's going here now. So therefore, Bina Adarab, because Bina is that way, it gives birth to substantive and midas. And that's why Bina is called the mother of the children. Because from Bina comes the birthing, the offspring of emotions. That there should be emotions that have substance, substantive, tangible, expressible. So then, one second, but we also learned that Bina sublimates the emotions. It elevates them, because the emotions on their own can be untamed and just follow their impulses and do whatever they want. So now he's going to explain. Yes, Bina gives birth to them, but Bina also does something else. Rak. Rak kishemeir gili er hameichin yeser. When the er hameichin radiates more and grow and in an increasing way, oza metzias u'b'pochus. Then the metzias of the midas, their body, their entity, is diminished. What he means now, diminished, he means tamed. Like we said, they're not just wild emotions. So there's two things here. There's giving birth to something that has substance, but there's also taming and refining it. Remember, we learned that Bina, even though it's not Chochma, especially Pnimis HaMoichin, has an effect on the Midas. It guides them, it tames them, it refines them, makes the Midas into Sichlim, cognitive emotions, even though not completely. But you don't change the Midas, but you definitely harness them and refine them. Ukaklal hayedua. Oh, I really see. He's really developing this into a whole. Okay, let's continue. Kaklal hayedua, like the known rule, or the known axiom or given rule. The mitzias hayesh udafke aidei tzimtzum u'mi eta'er. The mitzias hayesh comes specifically through concealment and diminishment of the light. So basically, when a light is shining very powerfully, in this case, let's talk about the divine light, something else can't really emerge as a separate entity because the light is so dominant. Like similar to, let's say, a teacher is teaching an idea and it's so overwhelming, the light is so intense, you don't really have room for yourself and your own identity. Or to use a different example, well, Chassidus says, wherever the Eir is stronger, the Keli is weaker. Wherever the Eir is weaker, the Keli gets stronger. So the more Eir there is, the less room for Yesh and Metzias. I mean, I was going to give the example of the conception of a child, the example we use often. So in that concentrated moment when there's just one cell, everything is there, but you don't have a Metzias and Yesh yet. You don't have a developed fetus. So in a qualitative level, it's a very concentrated force, but you don't have Metzias. It's like when they talk about the Big Bang in science and cosmology, they talk about that before the Big Bang, everything was so concentrated. So everything was very powerful, but because it's so powerful, that's why it doesn't have that expansiveness. As soon as you somewhat diminish that intensity, then things can spread out and in a more expansive and growing fashion. And when the air shines and radiates, then the yesh does not have that much substance. He says the yesh is not existent, it means, but it means the yesh is not in the form of expansive and substantive entity. Valkain, ikamitzias amidus. That's why the primary existence of emotions, hudafke kasher seichel misalam. It's only when the seichel gets concealed. V'nisha raka b'chein. And the only thing that remains is the b'chein, which is the conclusion, the derivative or the takeaway message from that idea. In other words, when the idea is radiating very powerfully, the emotions don't have really room to express themselves. So he's basically explaining how Binah on one hand gives birth to emotions, but on the other hand, when the seichel grows, the air of the seichel diminishes and I would say harnesses and controls those emotions. The emotions on their own, when the seichel is not there or concealed, that's when they can go wild. Not so in a bad way. That's when they're most expressive. That's how he's explaining this right now. So it can be a little confusing because is Binah Yesh or not Yesh? The answer is it's Yesh compared to Chochma. It definitely is substance. But on the other hand, Binah does a lot for the emotions to make them more refined. That's what he's discussing both ends of this story here. Now the Bechein is, though we didn't mention it here, but we learned it earlier, that whenever any comprehension of an idea, you always say, so what's the takeaway message? The takeaway message is where it's going to impact the emotions. Let's, for argument's sake, you're learning about Atzilus. You're learning about something, I'm specifically using a divine example, something about godliness. And you're really understanding Atzilus is bittul, how it's completely a divine structure. You can, at that point, while you're learning it and trying to really understand it, suddenly get all You can't move into the. You're more in the absorbing mode than the processing mode, and especially the time is not there yet to say, okay, I'm so excited about this, and now I'm going to translate that into an action. I'm going to go out now. Based on that, I'm going to go and speak to other people and spread Yiddishkeit or spread Chassidus. So in the healthy process, when you're in the cognitive state, you're learning it, you're understanding it, you're appreciating it. It does awaken in the mind feelings, but they're still contained within the mind. We're called midas sichlim, the midas shabaseichel. But then, when you're finished, then you can allow yourself the license to really say, oh, unbelievable. I mean, it doesn't mean you can't do that in the middle of learning, but really the real expression is going to come at the end. And what's the takeaway from it? I take away, you know what? What I just learned now for the last few hours and really absorbed and understood in Binah compels these and these emotions. So the real full-blown emotions are there when the mind somewhat recedes, but they're born out of it. For example, on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, we gain forgiveness and hope after Moshe Rabbeinu impacted and convinced God to forgive the people, the holiest day of the year. But we don't celebrate and dance and sing. It's a very humble and a very quiet day. When do we dance? We start dancing 4 days later, Sukkot. And it grows the dance all the way to Simchas Torah. Because when you're standing before the king, even if, and you hear the king say, I love you, I forgive you, we are forever connected. So of course there's great joy inside of you. But you don't start making somersaults and dancing in front of the king. Because then you are receiving this great gift. Then when you leave the presence of the king, so to speak, and you go outside, that's when you start dancing and singing and celebrating. So in some ways, that's how it works. But that there's the experience of it in the mind, and then when the oir is very powerful, the midas have to be kept at bay. But then there comes a point where the bechein, the result of it, is an explosion of midas and emotions. And in this case, they're directed by Binah. So you have both elements here. The emotions were born from Binah, because Binah is a yesh and mitzias compared to Chochma. But at the same time, as the mind grows, the mind also tames and keeps the midas in a refined way. And as he says here, the more the oir is shining, the less the mitzias of the yesh. When the oir gets more diminished, that's when the mitzias of the yesh of the midas become more apparent. I'll just read one more sentence. But when the Eir HaSeichel is radiating, not the bechein, not the end of the process, but while you're in the middle of understanding something and it's radiating powerfully, and specifically primis hameichin, like he said, where you're focusing on the very core of godliness, not on godliness as through the lens of existence. Like he said, primis hameichin, without the levushei hasaga, not so much on the garments that you understand it, how you understand it on your terms, the subject itself. Ein midas b'chinas mitzias murgish. The mitzias, the midas are not in the form of existence, or some type of tangible or palpable existence. So then how does it stem with what we just said? That Binah gives yesh. He says, ein zeh she'inyan habinu lasis habitul ba'midas. So even though Binah does refine them, it's not the point that Binah is supposed to nullify them. Adarabah, inyan habinah. On the contrary, Binah's inyan, huliyas hamidas b'chinas mitzias, is that midas should be existent. Rak mitzad gili eir haseichel, but just due to the revelation of the mind, the cognitive focus and power, bohem, Like I said, Gilead HaSeichel Bam. Due to the Gilead HaSeichel and these midas, Mishum Zeh Ein B'chinas Metzias Morgish. They're not that blatantly defined as just midas that just doing their own thing. As we spoke about, subjective midas. The midas are very much aligned to the right purpose. But Binah is not there to nullify or to eliminate midas. It's there to create a metzias of midas, and then that the midas should be directed and not just untamed and going every possible direction. Aval Chochma in Yonahu Lasis Habitl Dafke. Chochma, on the other hand, comes to introduce another dimension of real selflessness, of real bittul, where the midas cease to be sensed at all, and the whole being of the person is completely absorbed to experience something greater. So Binah is like an in-between. You have the midas on their own, and as we learn, the different growth and development of the midas, all the way to Moichin, Ibr Yunika Moichin, Mutva, Murgish, Muskel of Binah. Remember, we learned the Murgish Mitzad HaSeichel, and then Seichel itself, Binah Primius HaMoichin, but that's still all in the development of the midas. And with Chochma, you take it to another paradigm altogether, which we're going to continue learning from here going further. But now he's introduced Yesh and Ayin in this whole context. So I'll stop here before this parentheses. I'll just read the parentheses. Shezeh inyan hachachma toiz lechochem, that Chochma gives strength and support to a Chochem. That's what Chochma does. It gives power. In this case, bittul, like we learned earlier in a number of places, in a number of different Maimarim. One more line, just because it's the middle of the sentence. V'hu sha'chochmu b'chinas ayin, and this is that Chochma is the level of ayin, not yesh. Uma be'etzem, ayin uma be'etzem. It's ayin and ma, like koyach ma meaning like what? A bittul. The inyanu ulas is kol yesh la'ayin. So this is what Chochma is, ayin and ma, fundamentally a state of bittul. The inyana, its purpose, its function, its role is to call, as last is kol yesh la'ayin, to take every yesh and turn it into an ayin. That's a pretty powerful statement. So Chochma is the gift we were given, where I spoke about how Moichin leads us to a higher reality. Chochma is the ayin, that the place where the yesh of existence is transformed into an ayin. So you see how vital it is in the interface of where existence meets beyond existence. Like it says elsewhere. So we reached the bottom of page 1232. I went a little over, but does anybody want to ask anything now? Because I'm going to stop here.
I have a question. If we can just do Chassidus applied, talk about it perhaps in more Balabatisha terms. So if we want to change our emotional nature, then the mechanism is through bittul, is through Chochma. And at a practical level, is this, if you had to give a psychological metaphor, would you say this is a matter of concentration? Of course, there's a focus on God, but there's something mental going on there. So is the Rabbi Rashab saying that if you want to change your nature, if you want to get a harness on your emotions and transform them, then it comes through some form of mental concentration? Is that a fair translation, or am I too far off base?
I would reserve, before we get into applying it, to hear more till he finishes the subject matter. Because we got to hear more details of what Chochma is exactly, whether it's what you just said or others. I don't think it's just about concentration. I think it's about bringing you to another reality of experiencing the divine. I think it's probably almost impossible to reach Chochma without first going through Binah. So I think it's really about a journey of how we experience things that are outside of ourselves. most people, even in the highest levels, are not yet ready to be absorbed into a higher reality. First, you have to make sure that that which is your mitzias and yesh is aligned properly. So my guess would be that Chochma is taking it to another dimension. That's not as simple than just saying it's more concentration. But I would reserve conclude anything conclusive until we finish the subject, and then we can see the whole picture, and then apply that to see how that works in each one of us. But I'm not saying what you're saying is wrong. I'm just saying it's premature for me to really
I hear you.
comment.
A follow-up question. I assume this is implied here, but one must ask. And maybe you can't speak about it just yet, forever. But is there a saying here that essentially it's not just the Chochma, like you were starting to say, is something outside of oneself, because there's a bittul of the yesh. We're just sort of talking about it here, and focus on the Ayin, which is God, even beyond the godliness. It's beyond what we can understand. It's part of this world. So if you had to have a conversation with, let's say, a goy or a non-believer, and they say, you have a conversation, do you think you can change your emotional nature? And I come back and I say, well, yes, it's possible at times. It has to do with these concepts. And then they say, okay, so you can only do it if you believe in God, meaning that the Chochma has to be focused on God. It's not just something outside of yourself, some point that's outside of yourself. It's other. It's not yourself, but it's dafka God, meaning you cannot change your emotional nature unless the focus of the Chochma, the essence of it is God. Period.
It's a very
There's
different
no other
discussion.
Uh-huh.
It's a completely different discussion that yes may extend from this, but I would reserve that separate discussion entirely, because it's not what he's discussing here. He didn't say that here. He just said that there's that concept of changing. That's another discussion. Can you, for example, if a person who's a scientist and completely absorbed in their scientific discovery and they don't even feel their ego, or they eat or drink or any of their own thing, and they just are dedicated to something to discover an idea that is revolutionary, can they be in a state where they're completely absorbed in something greater than they are, and even forego their own natural inclinations, meaning hunger or even their emotional structure? You can make an argument that there is a taste of it, that anyone who really experiences high levels of intellectual activity can actually shift in their personality. The question is it temporary or permanent, and is it really shifting or not shifting? It's really another discussion about how God comes into the picture and whether you can really change something without the God element, because at the end of the day, everything in existence does have its parameters. So, but he didn't talk about that. He didn't say, for example, that the question would be, how could you change a natural order? I mean, we did say the miracle comes from a greater place, let's say Chochma, like he said, the level of Chochma, the level of what he said, Chochma, that is Lamaila from Hatva, like open miracles. So, but he didn't make a case and say that only through accessing God you can change yourself. So let's see how he goes about that as well, how he explains that. And that's a good discussion of its own. Can we have a taste of that even without using a divine element? And you can make the argument both ways. You could say you have a taste, maybe not completely. But meanwhile, he's talked about a level of bittul. And that question is also, does anybody that is not God-driven even interested in having such bittul? You could argue most people don't want such bittul. Who says it's if you told some people you can reach a level where you can go beyond your nature, they say, I don't want to go beyond my nature. What's wrong with my nature? I'll be refined. I'll try to be as good as I can. But why is it an objective? Why is it even ideal and a standard for me to go beyond myself? So there's a lot to be said about all this.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was a fascinating expansion of my questions. Thank you for addressing it. Appreciate it. It was an amazing shiur. Thank you very much.
Sure. Anybody have questions on the thing, what we actually studied here, or everything is pretty clear on that end? Okay, so we're stopping at the